And so does the public education system in K-12. And so we're trying to figure out ways to hack into that and to change that dynamic. And it's not easy, to say the least. My question is the current Hive network scheme, as it's currently put together, is the funding and the development of it based on open source to the extent that you're thinking of seeding, you've got Chicago, you've got New York, you may have one or two other places that are going to be applying for RFPs, and then just kind of say, okay, we've got those few things in place, but we're going to open source for everything else? Or do you see it like, is there opportunities for other universities or other organizations in the country to come forward and request support for starting something like this, or would we more be along the lines of the open source model?
Both. Open source is definitely a core philosophy, and so whether that's code or education programs, or sort of how you catalyze towards the Hive, but then I guess they're also kind of thinking together about what is a more explicit on-ramp towards creating a Hive. So, and I think that those actually work in tandem. And I just want to say, in both, there are university partners within the Hive, which is also an important piece. So in New York, that's Parsons and Bank Street College of Education, and Christina is
Northwestern and the University of Chicago.
Northwestern must have put a significant effort behind this project, I imagine.
It's one arm of Northwestern in this particular example that we showed earlier. So, and we actually funded part of that effort. So they're actually keeping funding of this project now, and we push them into a new sphere. But we see them, like all of the other education students, as network partners. They're in our network. I don't make these divisions, and when we come together and we're working on a project, yes, there's a university person here with a museum, but we're not really making those distinctions. Everything that we're doing, and to your open source question, at least in Chicago, I think we're documenting everything. The processes, the models for the RFP, all of this is completely available, and we're sharing it. And yes, there are new cities who are thinking, who have models in place. Maybe they have a mini network already started around a content area, and they're thinking, how can we get bigger than that? And we're happy to pass on our learnings for what that looks like when you expand to a city-level network. I don't think that we have an answer yet to the model for financing something like that. We're still trying to figure that stuff out, but everything we know is completely open and something we gladly share.
So if it's consistent with the model that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate, but if it's consistent with those practices that you've established and documented and shared, and supports that kind of work and this, Hamago and everything, then that is going to give us some sense of greater value that if we were to try to seek funding just for cost recovery on our campus.
I would think
a fair statement?
Yeah.
Take some other questions. Yes, sir?
Hi, my name's Doug Belshaw. I'm from England. Chris, I met you at the pop-up in Hive London, which was great. I really enjoyed that. So I've just been looking on your website and having a look at the number of resources which are available. And it just seems to me that there's a whole community of people who'll be really interested in taking this, especially internationally, and just kind of running with it and then feeding back in. And obviously it wouldn't be kind of official Hive stuff, but there's such enthusiastic people who would just take it and run with it. So in the UK at the moment there's Teach Meets, where it's a bunch of teachers put their name on a wiki, come together, talk about stuff, they have like 5 or 7 minutes to share things. And there's a whole kind of cadre of teachers there who would love to do something with students because they haven't got this model for being able to do something. And you've got the model, but it feels a bit constrained in the fact that we can't really do anything with it over in England because we haven't got the funding for it or anything like that. And I just wondered whether there was any scope for making a community around the fantastic work that you've done so far, so that type of thing can happen internationally.
So in London specifically, Mozilla is trying to get those funds and is actively pursuing the kind of seed funds that would start to organize that around. So coming out of the Hive pop-up and the London Mozilla Festival. So that there are people, that is in play in terms of what would be just the financial underbelly to make that happen. And we did learn a ton, like the Teach Meets are so inspirational. I learned a lot about that while I was there and afterwards. And so I've actually learned from their model to a degree about community building amongst educators. And I would say everyone should look into the sort of grassroots, sort of bottom-up teaching even in the UK. So I guess my answer is that is sort of happening, and hopefully there might even be some announcements soon on the UK front. But also, I think, to harken back to what Christina said, and we have to get better at the mechanisms for sharing. You know, you can always ask and we'll always give, but we're actively working on what are those sort of more distributed models, sort of self-serve sharing.
One other thing to consider too is that the demand or the desire to create these kinds of networks is expanding much faster than the hive is, by several orders of magnitude. So I think that while we don't want to slow down there's individual expressions of how to do networking in this sort of new way, we certainly do want to make what we're doing, specifically working with teens and tweens, on how organizations can connect together. And to some extent, this really encourages organizations to work in ways that they should have probably been doing before the money came in. But it certainly accelerated that process, which was helpful. Question in the back.
Earlier you said that this wasn't intended to replace school, and I'm wondering why not?
Why not?
Because I think a lot of what you're doing is what ASD talked about in the keynote about learning through play and the deep interest-based learning and you know, the knowledge ecologies and the community building pieces, and it seems like this is the technology piece that has, like, the Dewey and Montessori things could be scaled up. So why not make them B-school?
You know, I think this is a question we can throw across the board. My quick sort of response to that is that by looking at it quite in that way, we're focusing too much on school as opposed to what the opportunities might be for youth learning. And that would be an important thing, that if it just so happened that school or the functions of school or the activities that we engage in were replaced, modified,
There you go. Look at the little system with the tree growing.
as an outcome, but not necessarily the goal.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is maybe it is school, instead of thinking about, like, changing school to be that, maybe that is school. Like, what about crediting kids for the work that they're doing so that, I'm not saying, like, take an institution and make it that thing. I'm saying that thing may already be an institution.
Sure, I think
Put wings on it, bolts and training wheels on it.
PC answer that. I actually think we are talking very much about reconfiguring learning broadly, and school today, what is called school, is a building and a session, is something that would be completely rethought in the Hive learning model. We have something of a diagram on this, that our vision, and it's not here today, and maybe not even in 5 to 10 years, but the vision is that learning is happening everywhere, and it's not bound by the walls of the school. So yes, I actually think the model that you just described is what we're striving towards. We are today not saying we're in schools, because we're not. We are bridging into that territory, but I see it long-term, it is replacing what is the current education model. That's what we are striving towards. A school day a learning day could look like today a traditional school building is offering some curriculum, some opportunities, and that bridges into a museum, and then bridges to the business down the street. It's this completely connected and seamless experience, and that's a high vision, but it is definitely what we're striving towards, and we're demonstrating that learning is happening outside of the classroom, and it should be credited, it should be recognized, what school can't teach, it should be acceptable to learn outside of that structure. So I think we're definitely, that's our large vision. And today in Chicago, we have one really great opportunity. We have this extended day. Are people familiar with that? Where the school day has been extended by an hour and a half, and with no planning around that. So everybody has had an hour and a half to the school day, and we have to figure out what to do with it. And we see this as our entry point. So here's, like, if we can take over that hour and a half, maybe that's a program where kids leave the building and they go to the local Y and they're doing something on STEM that they don't get to do during the day. That's how we're going to start, I think, to morph into a model that's truly about the vision of learning anywhere, anytime.
There are precedents. There's a program, it's a STEM-based program, it's called MESA, Math, Engineering, Science Achievement. And they've actually been able in some schools in California to construct a class within the school day as part of the A through G required courses for entry into UC and CSU.
Wow.
That's a hands-on math and science course. So it can happen, it has happened.
Yeah.
So that's exciting, I think, for
We
the
just
future.
go to this too. The Atlas Planetarium is one of our member sites, and they work very closely with the high school academy on the west side of Chicago, where they bring in astronomy curriculum. They actually have a resource on Adler that goes and teaches there for several hours a week, and then brings those youth back to the Adler and out of school opportunity. So there's this true bridging of this institution in terms, not just the curriculum, but kids are leaving the building and doing the learning exercise that kids are trying to do back. And I think that's the seamless model. Yes.
And just to follow up, I'm from Big Picture Learning, so our schools all have kids out of the building 2 days a week doing internships.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so that fits really nicely with exactly what you're talking about.
I love big picture.
I do too.
So I think it's really interesting in that I've sort of been following the Etherpad, and I know the connection's wonky and might not work on everyone's platform, but we got a lot of intense pushback about that we were sucking resources, or that this, are we trying to replace? So sort of from the exact opposite sort of vantage point about this, are we being an aggressor towards school, or so it's really interesting. I just wanted to sort of point that out, and so I think I take a slightly different view in that we need. So I'm not looking to blow up school, and I don't or say that school needs to look radically different necessarily. I come from a family of teachers. I'm very sort of politically activated by sort of sometimes what I think is an aggressive move against schools and teachers. So I'm sympathetic to that viewpoint. However, I think so I think that the partnerships, which I think sort of what we're talking about a little bit, need to start becoming more transparent and overt. We haven't done that with Hive because we're only 2 to 3 years old. And so, a lot of times people say, well, why aren't you working with schools? Well, we're not sure that our innovations are school worthy yet, honestly, or that they're ready for schools, or that the high stakeness of schools might not work. It might not raise test scores. It might not be ready. It might not be adoptable. And we also want that space to experiment, to fail, to iterate, that school wouldn't necessarily, school as a large system, I know there's schools, I'm not talking about it in a micro way, would squash the things that we think that some of the innovations that we're onto, or that, so, and that's starting now, I think, to start to figure out what those more explicit pathways and where those beginnings of those collaborations, and we're doing those in a number of ways. But I find, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I can match the color code, but I sort of take a little bit of umbrage with the comment here, and that we're somehow, that this kind of building up an ecosystem of informal learning opportunities is somehow a giant resource drain on schools. And that just doesn't seem, I don't understand why you can't have a robust approach to education and learning that both systems are in concert, and that having strong systems of informal learning opportunities in what have been long traditional education spaces, libraries, museums, after-school programs, can't be, why that's an either-or proposition.
Yeah, as one of the people who wrote those comments, being a person who's working within the existing school system and trying to push those innovations out rather than having them pushed in, which both of those things are happening. There's a place for both of those things. But I think one of the things that I'm concerned about is I think it's a bit naive for us to assume that resources are not limited at this point. And I think that given a limited resource environment, we should talk about the larger philosophical things, which is what is the wisdom of having infrastructure that's being built outside of the school system that uses philanthropic sources of funding as opposed to public funding. So that's one of the larger things that I have a concern about. But from a practical standpoint, the dollars that are being spent in organizations outside of the school system oftentimes are better spent within. And I made the comment that our school spends an additional $1,000 per student than what we're given by the state that we go out and raise. But for that $1,000, our outcomes are pretty broad. That our outcomes reflect reduced dropout rates, higher test scores, more engagement with core curriculum. So there's that. There's the fact that the school is already a hub, and if we want to reach students, the school is already a hub of the community. Why not use that resource that public funds have already gone into to create what you're trying to create.
Well, James, by your own admission, what you just said there is that you're measuring things based on test scores, based on non-dropouts.
No, I didn't say that.
You just said that.
I did not. I said outcomes. I said achievement.
Right, okay, well, whatever measures you're using, I think what Chris and Rusty Hive are trying to get at is that these kind of things, if it was publicly funded, at least in the UK, it might be different in the US, but if things are publicly funded, things only have a shelf life. They have to prove they have an impact on the narrow measures which I just mentioned you rejected, okay, fair enough. But they're measured on those outcomes, and I think the Hive, because they've got different funding streams, because they've got a different model, they can fail, in inverted commas, yet be successful in the long term when they'll be shut down for public funding.
I like that.
Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, you interjected things that I didn't say into that, so.
I
don't
could go on
necessarily
forever.
disagree with what you're saying. I just say you mixed up your metaphors with my metaphors.